This is Knockout Week on Biography. Our look at 5 men whose fists and fierce determination took them from the streets to the top of their sport. Tonight, George Foreman. He traded life in a gang for a pair of boxing gloves and the heavyweight championship of the world. Seeing him on television as a kinder, gentler pitchman, it's easy to forget that George Foreman was once one of the most feared fighters in the world. A man with a punch so powerful that many worried Foreman might inadvertently kill an opponent one day. Before that day could come, Foreman gave up fighting and committed his life to a higher power, only to miraculously reascend to the top of the boxing ranks and become the darling of Madison Avenue.
He was on the wild, he was out of control.
This guy with wrecking balls at the end of his wrists. He's become a national institution, proof that a human being can actually be one person and then transform and be another person in another state.
Hallelujah, I'm born again.
He had plenty of anger before he became famous.
George Foreman's story is anybody can. It's a tremendous success story.
In the years after World War II, America was a country of power, wealth, and prestige. Veterans were going to college on the GI Bill, and more white Americans than ever could look forward to a life of comfort and financial security. That was not the reality for George Edward Foreman. He was born in Houston, Texas on January 10th, 1949, and had little to look forward to.
George always used to like to use the word po. Because, you know, to be poor means you may have had a little something, but we had nothing. So we were po. It was P-O, and that's about as far as it went.
George, whose nickname was Monkey, was the 5th of 7 children born to Nancy Ree Nelson. She was the daughter of a sharecropper from Marshall, Texas. Nancy moved to Houston and worked 2 jobs as a cook to feed her children, but there was rarely enough.
She came home one night, and just all she had was this hamburger. And she looked at George. That was the hamburger right there by itself. He could have swallowed that whole thing, but she knew that everybody had to eat that night. So she sat down, and somehow or another, she came up with 7 slices.
Nancy was a woman of quiet strength who raised her large family almost by herself. George adored his mother, and even as a child, he dreamed of making her life easier.
He had an enormous amount of respect for her. There wasn't anything that he wouldn't do for her, and I really don't think there wasn't anything she wouldn't do for him.
Nancy was married to J.D. Foreman, but it was not a perfect marriage. J.D. worked on the railroad, drank too much, and was rarely at home. But when he did visit, he was a caring father. He always predicted a bright future for George.
He used to always pat George on the head. And he says, George Foreman, next heavyweight champion of the world. Wasn't even boxing.
George got along well with his siblings, but he flew into a rage if they called him Moorhead, a nickname he disliked but didn't yet understand. The family lived in the 5th Ward, the toughest neighborhood in Houston, often referred to as the Bloody 5th. It was the epicenter of poverty, a rundown collection of shacks where rats and violence thrived. Nancy relied on her religious faith as she struggled to bring her kids up to become decent people. But George had little interest in church, and in a neighborhood like his, there were few people to look up to.
It was very, very difficult for him, and he developed certain habits that he wasn't very proud of. I don't know if George had any real heroes at that time.
He did have at least one, the great Cleveland Browns running back, Jim Brown. George wanted to play football like him. George was on the team of E.O. Smith Junior High. He was a good player, but a very bad student. He constantly skipped classes, and before the end of junior high, he dropped out altogether.
People back there at E.O. Smith didn't think we could learn. Everybody thought we had this old hoodlum ways, hoodlum mentality. Teachers in schools, you can't learn, you ain't gonna do this, you ain't gonna amount to nothing.
George had no plans for the future, so he hung around, had a brief job as a mover, and spent a lot of time with his little brother.
We used to sit on the porch a lot, and we played this game where, you know, cars pass by, and we said, that's my car. And the next car come back, that's my car, next one be yours, right? But I always got the old cars, and he always got the new ones.
George was a friend to his brother, but in the streets, he was a menace.
He liked to fight a lot, and him and his friends
They would have like little gang fights. Everybody would be scared. You know, they think he's gonna do something to them and jump on him. They'll have those big chains and swords, and boy, they be at it.
George and his friends often got drunk. They burglarized houses and mugged people. They were constantly in trouble, and the police were always after them.
I would start stealing. I was a mugger, teenage thug, really. Had dropped out of high school. No chances at all.
We are going to build a great society.
But George's career in crime was cut short by President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. Johnson was trying to fight poverty with programs that offered educational opportunities, pathways to employment, and a better life. George happened to see a public service announcement for the Job Corps program on TV, and he and his friend signed right up. George was 16 when he flew to Oregon and left the bloody Fifth for the first time in his life. A world that he had only seen in his fourth-grade picture book opened up for him when he and his friend Roy arrived at the Job Corps camp in Grants Pass, Oregon.
Trees. It was completely wilderness. Looked like bear or something could come out the woods any second. You know, that was it. A lion, a cub, anything could come out the woods then. And that's where we were. It was a brand new adventure. We were very excited. We were more like Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn, huh?
In clean, safe surroundings and with 3 solid meals a day, George and Roy got a second chance to straighten out. They also got a second chance at school. With plenty of encouragement and supervision, they learned quickly, and their schoolwork showed it.
They started cramming us with academics and, you know, books and stuff like that, and they said, yeah, you can, and you can. Next thing I know, we took test after test, and we was, hey, y'all ready to move on? I said, thanks, Jesus.
They were transferred to a camp in Pleasanton, California 6 months later for on-the-job training. George and some of his fellow corpsmen took electronics courses. While his schoolwork improved, his behavior did not. George was quick to get in fights with his fellow students and got himself in serious trouble.
But what happened was I was down at the gym, and they called me and says, Doc, please come and help us. I says, for what? And said, we got a corpsman up here, we can't do nothing with him.
George was about to be expelled, but Doc knew that troubled kids often acted up to get attention. He decided to give George one last chance.
I said to him, I says, man, like you'd make a good boxer. You big enough, you ugly enough, and you should make a good boxer.
Doc took charge of the big, uncontrollable young man and began to train him.
He was mean, and he didn't believe in nothing. He only believed in himself.
Doc directed George's fist at the punching bag. Boxing subdued his temper. Still, George had no plans to make boxing a career, and after 2 years in the Job Corps, he graduated. Against Doc's wishes, he returned to Houston to get a job. He seemed to be a changed man.
His nickname was Monkey. When he came back to town, he was George Foreman. And my mother had to, readjust herself and hoping that even though, since he had become this George Foreman person again, that he could keep that and not go back into the monkey.
She would be disappointed. It was hard for a young black man to find a job in spite of the government's equal opportunity policies. When George failed, he went back to his old street habits, and his mother worried about her son, who was 18, idle, and too strong for his own good. Doc, too, was worried. He wanted George back in the ring and called George's mother.
Well, I said, Miss Nancy, where's your son at? He said, Doc, I don't know. I said, you find him. She says, well, I want him back out here. So I'm sending, as soon as I get through talking to you, I'm sending him a ticket. Come out here and I'll take care of it. Just like that, she said, thank God I found somebody that takes interest in my son.
George went back to Pleasanton, and Doc trained him hard. Doc had big plans and dreamed of sending his student to the Olympics. George had no idea of the recognition that a medal could bring. But Doc told him about Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, who had both won gold medals.
I explained it to him and everything, and I said, man, do you realize you win the gold medal, what'll happen?